Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched Harvey from 1950. Um, I can't remember what or when I have said things about Jimmy Stewart or James Stewart um, as an actor. I think he may have come up in the context of talking about the Philadelphia Story and High Society a few weeks ago. I feel like I've also talked about him before, but I can't remember what the context would have been because I don't think he's been in any of the other things I've discussed. Um, I have not seen him in very many things. I've seen It's a Wonderful Life, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and that's about it. And I love him as the leading man in this film specifically. I think he's got a very distinctive acting style and delivery in both of those two films. They are both incredibly iconic, arguably a lot more than this one. But of the three performances, I think this might be my favorite that I've seen. Harvey's a really interesting and relatively simple film. And I've talked before about how much I like things that either seem like they could be theater or were on stage before they were on film. And this was originally a play that was then turned into a movie. And a lot of while they make good use of the cinematic arts, there are some clues, including like a very limited cast and very few sets and locations and things like that, that make this a little bit more obvious that it was a play. That's not to its detriment, though. It's really to its favor. This is a simple concept with a fairly short cast list and a lot of complex issues that come out of like a reasonably simple plot. This is a comedy of sorts. It's a little bit absurdist. It's a little bit fantastical. It's a little bit of like a social commentary. And I think what I like about it most is that I think it rings even more meaningful today than it might have at the time that it was made. Now, not to look into the past with too much disdain, but I think there's a pertinent discussion to be had about the some of the meanings that can be taken from this movie in a modern context where things like mental health are still in dire need of improvement, but a hell of a lot better than they were in 1950. And it's weird to think that only 73 years ago or something like that, things were so drastically different. And how 100 years before that or 500 years before that, things weren't dramatically different than they were 73 years ago. But anyway, I digress. I think there's some really interesting discussions to be had here about what this movie says about family and friend relationships and mental health and how people see each other socially, and in a society that is ever growing towards more acceptance of difference and a more being more understanding of who people are and what they are working with, and how mental health affects everyone. That's not a question, that's a statement. It does affect everyone, but anyway. I think this movie has all the more importance today than it perhaps did in 1950. The core of the movie is very simple. It's on the cover. It's, if you've ever heard anyone talk about this film before, you've heard somebody say, oh yeah, it's about Jimmy Stewart and his friend the Invisible Rabbit. And that's not a spoiler because that's from the very beginning. The acting in this film is fantastic all across the board. I particularly like Jimmy Stewart's performance. Him acting around this invisible character is just great to watch. Like, I could just watch him do that, and you do for some not insubstantial parts of this film. But everybody around him as supporting cast is also really, really quite excellent. A lot of these are not names that I necessarily know, but some of them are faces I recognize. Marie Josephine Hull, who plays his sister, is definitely probably the secondary most important character in the plot in terms of sort of being a foil or antagonist, and having to both be sympathetic and understanding, but also like very upset and losing herself to being torn between like personal social struggles versus her feelings about her family and her brother, and so her performance is really great as well. A lot of the performances in this are a bit over the top and a bit cheesy, and I think that's important to this as well. If they were too direct, if they weren't a little bit absurd, this could get very dark very quickly. This is a movie that's talking about some heavy topics. And I think it even strays into some more practical ones where you could look at Harvey as a metaphor for mental illness in general. But the movie also directly touches on things like alcoholism and just the class divides and drug abuse and all these other things. And so it could get pretty dark pretty quick. But because the performances are theatrical, they are a little over the top, they are a little bit absurd in their reasonability, and everybody's a little bit hyper, it works so much better, I think, because of that. If not for that, it would I think it would get pretty dour and not be as compelling. Now, most of the characters have to play relatively straight. They're trying to be reasonable people, in counter to Jimmy Stewart's character, Elwood P. Dowd, who seems to be this sort of silly man who scares people by talking about how he has an invisible friend who's a 6'3.5" rabbit. But what the movie gets into fairly overtly is the point that he's not the problem. Like, yes, it's concerning for somebody to genuinely believe there's some invisible person there, but Elwood's not hurting anybody. He's just kind of odd. And if he was being motivated to do bad things or to hurt himself or other people or something like that, or if there was any sign that this was harmful to anyone in any way, it would be more concerning. But the whole framework of the film really frames around him as though he's going to be like sort of the center point that everybody has to deal with, but instead it's him having to deal with everybody else, everyone else's reactions to him being a little bit different. This could be, the metaphor here could be applied to any number of different social, societal issues about how difference is not tolerated. And in the framework of the film, they're using it to say, oh, Elwood's causing problems for his family because he's too weird and he scares the normal people away. But he's also this kind person who has a lot more, even though he's of a very upper class background, and like is providing for a bunch of for his family members. He chooses to be kind to everybody and to worry about the people who are who have been down on their luck for this, that, or the other reason. there's one scene in particular that really stuck out to me, which is sort of near the end of the film, middle end, like sort of the beginning of the final arc, where he sits and just has sort of a monologue towards these other two characters, and it's beautifully delivered, and the scene really frames everything I like so much about this film. Not only is the writing really excellent in terms of the dialogue and the ideas and the things that he's saying, but his delivery is so well paced. I believe it's basically one continuous shot. It's not crazy long, but like it's a very good performance. And in addition to that, he's sort of shrouded in this sort of dim, partial light, partial darkness. And the framing is just wonderful, and it's really like a testament to like what can be done with very little camera movement, very little lighting changes, very little physical acting other than like facial expressions and line delivery. And I think that that scene ties the whole of the movie together thematically, because it's sort of a moment when some of the people around him realize, like, not that they weren't already realizing this, but it's the final moment of, this is a kind person who worries about others and has problems of his own, or like has an unusual thing about himself, but that doesn't harm anybody. And these continual acts to try and fix him or get him out of society are maybe not a great thing. This is going to get into something I don't like about the film so much, and probably something that is more a product of the time, which is that the film really ends on a weird, or doesn't quite end, but the climax of the very final sort of climactic scene of the film ends in kind of a weird way, because everybody's, even after a lot of lead up that's sort of telling this story about how Elwood's a good, kind person, and people have come to, like, these people have come to understand him better and realize that like these acts that everybody's trying to take against him are maybe not necessary. It still sort of continues to go in that direction. And the final conclusion, while satisfying in its own right, and the narrative there as to why there's this final twist, that's satisfying in its own right, but it seems to miss an opportunity to say, to like firmly say, oh, there was nothing wrong with him after all. And I think part of that is just coming out of the culture of the time. This is still not an era of great understanding of any kind of, well, medical sciences in general, but especially the mental health sciences. And so I don't think it would really have been possible for them to just be like, oh, he's hallucinating, but who cares? And I can see how that also would have been a less compelling conclusion, and why the ending that it has is the way that it is. And ultimately, in spite of that, I think it maintains a really good, solid, consistent tone. That these comedic aspects all are in service of some genuine positive emotionality and appreciation of what different people with differences can be like, and why difference doesn't have to be feared, and how not everyone and not everything has to be fixed just because it doesn't seem to fit in the framework of expectations of the society that you already live in. I could keep dissecting this metaphor because I think it's a really powerful one that could be applied to so many different things. But I'm going to pull back from that because I don't want to like ruin the experience of watching it for the first time either. I think like I was saying before about that one particular scene, throughout the movie, this is a black and white film. It's some very good, not like exemplary, but some quite good use of sets and light and darkness. Some really good recontextualization of sets when they are under different conditions, daytime, nighttime, different emotional states, those sorts of things. The camera movement is dynamic without being distracting. It's just enough that you sort of remember. It is also reminiscent of theater in the sense of like, it doesn't pan back and forth. There's not a lot of reverse shot. It's a lot of wide angles, slow pans, and sort of experiencing the whole set, experiencing the whole room, experiencing all the people in it at the same time. And that also serves to, point towards the focus on social structures and social expectations, and behaviors of a bunch of different people who are all odd in their own ways, though they don't even, necessarily recognize it. The tone throughout is just exemplary. It's like it manages to keep a levity without losing its plot or getting too silly. I honestly don't remember the soundtrack all that much. I think it's pretty sparing. But what is there is, to my memory, perfectly good and helps to sort of set the stage. And now I'm thinking about the cinematography again, and like, as much as I like it, now I have to think more. I'm thinking more about how long some of those shots are, because I think there are a lot of scenes that are pretty long, and because there's not a lot of camera movement and it's fairly subtle, you don't notice how long the shot is. You don't notice that it's necessarily one continuous shot. And I don't, of course, I've talked about this before, and the oneers and all that shit. And clearly this is not trying to do oneers or anything like that. I think this is much more just a something about like what the performances, what performers can do when given just sort of their lines and a set, and not be asked to go too crazy. And there's just some great cinematography in there. And now I was planning on watching this again because it's excellent, but now I have something specific I want to look for too. I really like this film. I think it's super important. I think it's, as I said at the beginning, possibly more important and more relevant, more socially relevant than it ever could have been in its own time. And I will highly recommend it to pretty much anybody, unless you just can't tolerate comedy or black and white film or older film for some reason. There's no reason not to watch this. It's got a snappy pacing. It goes faster than you think, even though it's only 104 minutes. And just excellent performances all around. I really, really enjoyed this one. Thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been your host, the Social Solipsist, and I'll see you guys next time.